Good morning. I'm James Person, Senior Faculty Lead with Korea Studies here at SAIS. Delighted to welcome you here. This very timely event, particularly in light of developments in Korea's relations with its primary strategic partners in the region. ROK interests and interest in expanding ties with ASEAN nations and with India are nothing new. I recall 20 years ago now, attending events in Seoul that tried to create a larger East Asian common space, as one group put it, expanding trade and security ties with India and ASEAN nations. Today, of course, the difference is that we have a name for this policy, the new Southern Policy, launched by President Moon in November of last year, and a more pressing need to advance this policy. Looking at Korea's trade and security cooperation with ASEAN and India, today we have 3 panels. The first panel is going to look at trade relations, expanding trade relations. The second panel will look at expanding security cooperation. And finally, we'll have a roundtable that brings in China, Japan, and the United States to examine some larger regional challenges. We'll have coffee breaks after the first panel. Then we will have lunch after the second panel. So you'll have a chance to get some caffeine over the course of the day. Before I introduce my colleague, Professor Devesh Kapoor, let me just take this opportunity to say how pleased I am to be working with SAIS Korea Studies institutional partner, the Korea Development Institute School of Public Policy and Management. We are grateful to Dean Yu for coming and joining us today. We entered into this partnership in March of last year. This is the second of our joint events. We have many others planned for the rest of the year, including a couple of events, both here and one in Seoul, that look at the 40th anniversary of the Park Chung-hee assassination and the 12/12 Chun Doo-hwan coup. But looking at these in the light of new documents that are emerging from international archives. We're also planning for next spring an event that looks at Japan ROK relations, but we're doing it within the context of a re-examination of the 1965 agreement that led to the normalization of relations between the two countries. Again, looking at a lot of materials that were available from the diplomatic archives and from also legal materials that we will be curating and translating and releasing ahead of this event to provide context to the agreement and to some of the issues that continue to pose challenges to the relationship. If you have not done so already, I strongly encourage you to sign up for Korea Studies emails so that you can learn about these upcoming events and about other research and programmatic activities in Korea Studies here at SAIS. Let me just quickly remind you to please silence your cell phones, and it is now my pleasure to welcome and to introduce Professor Devesh Kapoor, the Star Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies and Director of SAIS's Asia Program. He was also recently named the inaugural chair of the soon-to-be-established Department of Regional and Comparative Studies, because it wasn't enough for him to oversee 60% of the global population. He's now responsible for all of humanity. Dr. Kapoor.
After that introduction, I'm sure you must be worried about the future of humanity. So, Ambassador Lee, Dean Yu, distinguished guests, and students, I am delighted to welcome you all to this important and timely event. As James mentioned, when he and I first started planning an event that looks at Korea's relations with South and Southeast Asia last fall, we could not have imagined that it would be so relevant and timely. We started discussing this event before President Moon Jae-in announced his new Southern policy last November. Yet, with Korea-Japan relations now, which are deeply strained, and with Korea stuck in the middle of the ever-expanding US-China trade war, the topic of trade, migration, and security cooperation of Korea with India and ASEAN countries has become more pressing for Korea. This event, in many ways, leverages the strengths of our Asia programs, and I'm very pleased that so many of our talented faculty will be joining us on panels today. We are delighted to be co-hosting the event with the Korea Development Institute of Public Policy and Management, a preeminent Korean institution that prepares not just Koreans but international students, including from ASEAN nations and from South Asia, in the areas of development economics and public policy. KDIS is our Korea Studies program's new institutional partner in Korea, and not just for myself, but I speak for Dean Elliott Cohen and for all of SAIS and for Korea Studies faculty, staff, and students when I say how grateful we are for their generous support. Let me sort of also say a few words to thank the Korea Studies and Asia Program staff who put this event. First of all, I really want to thank Dr. James Person, who's our real core anchor of the Korea Studies program. We simply could not have made this event or build this program without him. We're also very grateful for the many long hours that Ellie Chung, Seho Lee, and Meg Bittle have spent in planning this event. Now, you'll be hearing from me several times over the course of the day, so I'll end my remarks here and invite Dr. Jong Il Yu to the stage. Dr. Yu is the Dean of KDIS, a professor of macroeconomics. He's been a sort of visiting professor at UC San Diego, Tsinghua, and Beijing University. And in addition to his work in academia, he's the president of Jubilee Bank, which serves to aid debtors through consultation and education. Dean Yu, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to SAIS and to the podium. Welcome.
Ambassador Lee, Professor Kapoor, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. On behalf of KDI School of Public Policy and Management, I'm deeply honored and pleased to welcome you to this important event. Ambassador Lee, coming all the way from Seoul to share his observations and wisdom with us, I really thank you. Professor Kapoor, I know you're very busy being responsible for the future of humanity. And it was really gracious of you to take time out of your greatest responsibility. And Dr. Person and staff of the Korea Studies here at SAIS for having put together a wonderful program. As you probably know, President Moon Jae-in of Korea announced the new Southern policy in 2017. It aims to elevate Korea's strategic ties to its neighboring countries and shift India and ASEAN to a more central place in Korea's foreign policy agenda. Substantiating the administration's commitment to New Southern Policy, a presidential commission consisting of 11 ministries was formed under this new policy initiative, which is guided by the 3 Ps of people, prosperity, and peace. Given the geopolitical challenges Korea continues to face, most recently, as you all know, aggravated by straining relations with Japan, and also tensions between the US and China. This strategy of diplomatic diversification has proven to be insightful and forward-looking. It may also help Korea gain some needed leverage in the region. This is not to say, however, that Korea's engagement with ASEAN and India is recent or new. Since Korea signed a free trade agreement with ASEAN in 2007, the region has become Korea's second largest trading partner, second only to China. Korea's trade volume with India recorded an all-time high of over $21 billion last year. And under this new Southern policy, it hopes to more than double this figure and raise it to $50 billion per year by 2030. The exploration of trilateral cooperation among India, ASEAN, and Korea is also worthy of discussion, as the pressure from various competing initiatives continues to mount in the region and tensions flare between the US and China, leaving us Koreans in the crossfires. It not only seems prudent, but actually a necessity for us to look towards building a more robust regional architecture of cooperation that is inclusive and transparent. Having the added challenge of domestic security concerns on the Korean Peninsula, forging closer relations with our southern neighbors can create, hopefully, a collective influence that would lend some leverage to us as a middle power player in the region. Recent developments in Korea's international affairs highlight further the timeliness of this event. I want to thank the experts and scholars, and I know this conference is represented by many distinguished scholars from SAIS and other experts who are gathered here for giving us your time and helping shed light on the many challenges and opportunities you see for Korea and its regional partners in this regard. I look forward to the discussions ahead on how we should approach the many facets of these prospective trilateral and bilateral efforts together. Before I conclude my remarks, allow me to take this opportunity to thank SAIS Asia Programs and the Korea Studies team once again for co-hosting this event and helping put it together. The conference is, as Dr. Person mentioned earlier, the second event jointly hosted by KDI School and SAIS since we started our partnership. The first event was a conference on the March 1st movement and modern Korea, commemorating the movement's centennial anniversary, the watershed uprising against the oppression of Japanese colonial rule. It was a very successful event, and I expect today's conference will be equally successful. We are truly pleased to have our collaborative opportunities grow and look forward to seeing how this partnership continues to flourish. Dr. Person mentioned a couple of more activities that are planned for immediate future, both of which are going to give us a deeper understanding of the involvement of the United States in creating modern Korea. And it's I actually took part in a couple of conferences on Monday at CFR, yesterday at Hudson Institute, and there was a lot of concerns about strains growing in the US-ROK alliance coordination, and that, of course, has been accentuated, among other things, the conflict that is growing between Korea and Japan. And this problem cannot be understood completely without the role played by the United States, which is not very well known here. Although I can refer you to an op-ed piece by Alexis Dudden, a history professor at University of Connecticut, on the last Monday's New York Times, titled "America's Dirty Secret in East Asia." So I think this, our partnership with SAIS, under the guidance of Professor Kapoor and the efforts led by Dr. Person, is really, extremely important, and we're very thankful and we're very hopeful for our future. Once again, I wish to extend a heartfelt welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us for today's event. Thank you very much.
So I'll introduce the panelists first. Since we have PowerPoint, we'll take turns.
How about this?
If you want to do the introduction, because the
Okay.
PowerPoint will be done.
Okay, I'm Uk Son, an associate dean of the KDR School of Public Policy and Management. I'm in charge of Office of Development Research and International Cooperation. So I'm very delighted to play a moderating role for the first session of today's program. Theme of this session is Korean economic cooperation with South and Southeast Asia, focusing on trade, investment, and migration. Okay, now it's my great pleasure to introduce you the experts who contributed to this session. The first presenter, Bikram Nehru, is a distinguished practitioner in residence at Johns Hopkins University SAIS, specializing in the economic, political, and strategic issues confronting Southeast Asia. Prior to SAIS, Professor Nehru was the chair in Southeast Asian Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He also held a number of senior management positions at the World Bank, including chief economist and director for poverty reduction, economic management, and private and financial sector development for East Asia and the Pacific, and director of economic policy and debt department. And the second speaker, Professor Devish Kapoor. Actually, the James person early this morning introduced, but let me add a little bit more on that. He is the Star Foundation South Asia Studies Professor and Director of Asia Programs at SAIS. His research area has focused on the political and institutional determinants of economic development, political and economic consequences of migration, the effects of market forces and urbanization on the well-being in India, governance and public institutions, and higher education. Professor Kapoor published many influential research books, including, among many, the World Bank, the First Half Century, Public Institutions in India, Performance and Design, and Diaspora, Democracy and Development, the Impact of International Migration in India. Prior to joining the Johns Hopkins SAIS, he held appointments at Brookings, Harvard, and University of Pennsylvania. Finally, Song-il Kwak is a research fellow of Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, in short, KIEP, and faculty fellow of American University. He is a former Director General of the new Southern Policy Department at KIEP. His department has explored sustainable cooperation strategies with ASEAN region and India to solidify the new Southern policy. Professor Kwak is an author of a study on the strategies for building a regional production networks in ASEAN region. His talk is about the South Korea's new Southern policy and cooperation with the ASEAN. Okay, we have 90 minutes for this session. So speakers, please remember that you have 15 minutes for your talk so that we can have a sufficient amount of time for floor discussion. So now I'm going to ask Professor Nehru to present your work within 15 minutes.
Great, thank you. Perfect. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Chairs. Welcome to all of you. No, you're fine. Stay where you are. So just 2 weeks ago, President Moon wound up a 3-nation tour to Southeast Asia, which included countries in the Mekong Basin. And this was one of several trips that he's taken to the region, which highlights how important the region is to Korea. But before I begin, let me just introduce you to Southeast Asia itself. Southeast Asia is normally thought of, if I asked you how many countries there were in Southeast Asia and you told me 10, I'd give you an A grade. And my mnemonics would be, there are the 5 middle-income countries of Southeast Asia: Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. The 3 low-income countries are Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. And then the 2 small entrepot countries of Singapore and Brunei. But if you told me that there were 11 countries in Southeast Asia, I'd give you an A+ and send you to the top of the class, because there's also Timor-Leste, which is also part of Southeast Asia, but not part of ASEAN. Now, I'm going to start from the premise that trade and flows of investment, foreign direct investment, are good for growth. I'm starting with that premise. I don't wish to sort of prove it. And if you look at it from that perspective, then the relationship between Southeast Asia and Korea is a marriage made in heaven. Because these are 2 parts of the world. One in Southeast Asia is commodity rich. Korea is commodity poor. Southeast Asia has low levels of human capital. Korea is has got abundant human capital. So what's not to like? I mean, these countries should really be trading very intensively. But of course, marriages may be made in heaven, but making them work is very much an earthly responsibility. When you look at Southeast Asia has got a GDP of 2.8 trillion. It's got a population of 600 million. And if it were just one country, it would be the 7th largest economy in the world. So it's pretty important. And what's most important, of course, is that it is growing very rapidly. It's, of course, also situated between 3 very rapidly growing parts of the world. There's China, of course, there's Korea, and there's India. So it's perfectly positioned as a very rapidly growing economy. And I think if you look at the future, you will, as I will show you, the future also looks pretty good. But Korea isn't the only country that is focused on wooing Southeast Asia. There's Japan, of course, India, China, the United States. So I think Korea has a lot of competition in winning the hearts and minds, so to speak, of Southeast Asia. If you look at per capita income levels, especially at PPP terms, clearly Southeast Asia per capita income on average is not as large, but averages hide a lot. Southeast Asia is about one of the most diverse regions in the world. Singapore has a PPP per capita income of over 100,000, well above that of the United States. Whereas you have Cambodia, which has a per capita income of only 4,000. This is in PPP terms. And of course, these countries are hugely different in size and colonial histories and political systems, and of course, in levels of economic development. So do remember that there is a huge diversity in this region. Now, looking to the future, I think all projections show that just as you have diversity in per capita income level, there's also going to be diversity in projected growth and in potential increases in urbanization. But broadly speaking, what this picture shows you is that the low-income countries are likely to grow the fastest because that's really catch-up that's taking place. And they're also going to have the most rapid rates of urbanization. The middle-income countries are going to grow less fast, and of course, being already largely urbanized, are not going to have that sharp increases in urbanization, although Indonesia is going to grow, is going to have a substantial amount of urbanization. And then, of course, you have Singapore, which is already, of course, 100% urbanized. So this is a region which is undergoing rapid change, is going through rapid convergence, and it is, in a sense, a perfect partner for a country like Korea. There are other complementarities. This is one important one. If you look at demographic profiles, Korea is an aging society. The bulge in the population on the male side and the female side are relatively high level age brackets. And in that sense, the similarities, of course, are with Singapore and with Thailand. Thailand and Singapore have very similar age profiles. But Korea is very different from the age profiles of the rest of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is a relatively young region. And you have basically large amounts of people who are going to be entering the labor force who are very young. And potentially, if Southeast Asia can capture that demographic dividend, then it would be another boost for its potential growth rates. But if you look at Vietnam and Thailand, and Malaysia, these are two countries that you can see have a growing bulge in the center. In other words, these are societies or economies that are on the verge of aging. They are right at the peak of the demographic dividend, and they are likely to age rapidly, whereas the others still have a few decades left, especially Indonesia, which has another 2 decades left before the labor force begins to peak. So there are these enormous complementarities between Korea and Southeast Asia, and it's been recognized by Korea, it's been recognized by Southeast Asia, and the two groups, that is ASEAN and Southeast Asia and Korea, have had intensive efforts at promoting integration. This is not a new story. It's been going on for decades. And to give you an example, here is a chronology of meetings that have taken place between ASEAN and Korea. There's a FTA for goods. There's an FTA for services. There's also an agreement on protection of investment, dispute resolution mechanisms. But we have to be a bit careful here, because ASEAN is very good at meetings. It's very good at having trade agreements. But ASEAN as a group, frankly, is not particularly powerful in forcing that or in ensuring that its member states actually follow these rules. Its capacity to monitor and implement are very weak. The countries are very strong. So Korea has rightly also entered into intensive dialogue on trade and investment with the ASEAN member states individually. For example, right now, there is a deep discussion of having a comprehensive and strategic partnership with Indonesia, which is taking place even as we speak. So given this intensive dialogue, it should come as no surprise that Korea now is the 5th largest trading partner with Southeast Asia. You have, of course, China, EU, Japan, the United States as being the top 4, and then you have Korea as being the 5th largest, about $150 billion of trade between Korea and Southeast Asia. But you also have Korea as being the 7th largest, at least in 2017, was the 7th largest foreign investor in Southeast Asia. The first 6 months of this year, it was the 2nd largest. Over the last several years, it's been around the 5th largest. So it's certainly punching above its weight when it comes to foreign investment. But what I want to highlight is the fact that it's a mistake to look at Southeast Asia as one group, given the fact that there are so many differences between nations. So it's instructive to take a look at Korea's investment in Vietnam, which is its most important destination country for foreign investment. Korea there was the 2nd largest investor in Vietnam after Japan, and there's a large amount of investment that's also by ASEAN, which is sort of that amount. So there's a lot of intra-ASEAN investment as well that takes place. But be careful here, because a lot of intra-ASEAN investment actually comes from Singapore. And a lot of that Singaporean investment is actually foreign investors first investing in Singapore, and those resources finally going to other ASEAN countries. So a lot of Singaporean investment is actually not Singaporean in a sense. They're actually investors from outside Singapore, located in Singapore, and investing in the region. So one has to remember that a substantial amount of that is actually foreign investment. It's very difficult to tease out the individual countries within Singapore which are responsible for that level of investment. And this shows you how important Vietnam is to Korea. It was brought to my attention, for example, that Samsung is a huge investor in Vietnam. It has 3 very large factories, and Samsung's investments in Vietnam now account for 30% of all of Samsung's investments worldwide. And if you look at the amount of investment that's going also into Singapore, so these two, it's Vietnam and Singapore that dominate Korea's interest in the region. Yes, there are investments elsewhere, but these two countries dominate. And the question is, why? Why is that the case? Because if you look at tariff rates, this is the common effect of preferential tariff, but if you look at also the Korea FTA, the Korea-ASEAN FTA, substantial reduction in tariff to 0% for 90% of goods, and another and a cap of 10% for sensitive items. So in other words, tariffs are very, very low. And that applies across the board in Southeast Asia. So why is it that Korea focuses just on Vietnam and Singapore to a very large extent? And the reason is this, that a lot of the barriers to trade in Southeast Asia are behind the border. These are non-tariff measures. Now, this is a 2009 number because it's very difficult to actually calculate the tariff equivalent of non-tariff measures. But there are huge differences in non-tariff barriers across countries in the region. Actually, many of these countries, Indonesia, and of course, you have Malaysia, and even Vietnam to some extent, have very large non-tariff barriers. Similarly, if you look at barriers to services trade, here, for example, out of 45 countries, Indonesia is 44th, Malaysia is 36th, right? Korea doesn't do terribly well itself either, so there are substantial barriers to services trade. Now, I make this point because I believe that services harbors the largest potential for trade in Asia, in the region. It is the largest component, it is the fastest growing component of global trade. It is the most protected part of economies in the region. And if the services sectors were to be liberalized, we could see a very substantial boom in services trade growth in the region. And I believe that if Korea and Southeast Asia were to focus on this issue, there is a potential engine for growth that is yet to be tapped. Similarly, when you look at the foreign direct investment restrictiveness index, again, very large differences, but what is instructive is that these red columns are Southeast Asia. The ones, the very small, it's very small type, so I don't expect you to read them. But you have the Philippines, you have Indonesia, and you have Malaysia as being the three red columns here, right? And then subsequently, you have Laos and you have Vietnam, which is down here somewhere. The green line is actually Korea itself. So large differences in FDI restrictiveness. And this, in a sense, explains why it is that countries like Korea, but it's not just Korea, focus a lot on Vietnam and on Singapore, because these are the countries which are the most receptive. Vietnam has now is part of the CPTPP. It has very good infrastructure. It is clearly pro-business. It is very much pro-trade. And therefore, it is a very desirable location for investment by many other countries, especially Korea. Another thing to keep in mind is the growing fragmentation of trade, the fact that now we have regional value chains in the region. So if you look at these backward and forward linkages, so these are, on this side, these are forward linkages, those are backward linkages, right? These are countries which have high levels of forward and backward linkages, and clearly Singapore, again, dominates. We have, again, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and surprisingly, the Philippines is up there, to be honest. I'm quite surprised by that. But certainly Vietnam is in that category of high levels of backward linkages as well as forward linkages. Backward linkages are the most important because this means components are brought into these countries, they're processed, and then they're shipped abroad for further processing in third countries before they're finally shipped to markets. From here, what I would like to focus on are just 3 or 4 areas where there's huge potential for attention on policy. I've already mentioned services trade as being a very important potential driver for growth, something for both sides to think about. I also want to highlight the fact that the digital economy is perhaps is arguably a very promising area for further development between Korea and ASEAN. It is a $50 billion industry right now in ASEAN. It is growing at 27% a year, phenomenal growth rate. Likely to be 6% of GDP by 2030, by 2025, I beg your pardon. And what we mean by the digital economy is the application of internet-enabled technologies to the production and trade of growth. It includes fintech, it includes e-commerce, and there's enormous potential because Korea is the leader when it comes to investment in in digital in the digital sector, in ICT. By far, not by far, but the largest investor in greenfield projects, although when it comes to acquisitions, it's much less so. But the reality is that Korea is a very important player in this area. And I'd just like to turn to two public policy questions. The first question is, what else can Korea do in the public policy sphere? Korea has a relatively small aid budget. It accounts for something like 5% of the grants and loans in total going to ASEAN. And so the challenge for Korea is, how do you make sure that this money is extremely well used for the interests of both Korea as well as Southeast Asia? This is the current breakdown of how that money is spent. It's largely for either economic infrastructure or for social infrastructure. In the case of Indonesia, there's a large amount which is going to what are called production sectors. But for Vietnam, for example, it's equally divided between economic and social infrastructure. By economic infrastructure is meant transport, energy, whereas for social infrastructure, things like health and education. If you look at what are the binding constraints to growth in Southeast Asia, where does Southeast Asia need resources the most? The answer unequivocally, in my view, lies in two areas. The first area is in infrastructure. Now, I'm not suggesting that this small amount of money that Korea provides as ODA, as official development assistance, to Southeast Asia be focused on infrastructure, because it would get lost in the mix. There are huge providers of infrastructure finance in the region. There's the ADB, the World Bank, the AIIB, the NDB, and of course, a whole series of bilateral institutions, including Chinese banks as well as the EIB and so forth. But the problem in Southeast Asia is not the availability of finance for infrastructure. The problem is the availability of good projects. And that's where Korea could make a difference. The fact that it has the capabilities, the skills, the capacity to help Southeast Asian countries, especially countries like Indonesia, Myanmar, and some of the low-income countries, in developing good projects for infrastructure in a way that is, in a sense, unbiased and can provide an appropriate platform then for finance from these other sources of finance. The other big area, of course, is human capital development in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia has a huge human capital deficit. And it's very interesting that Singapore and Korea are right up there, number 1 and number 2, in the Human Capital Index, which has just recently been prepared by the World Bank, whereas many of the Southeast Asian countries are in the bottom rung, so to speak, out of 157 countries. Countries like Indonesia, Cambodia, Myanmar, here human capital is a serious binding constraint to growth. Now, I'm not suggesting again that Korea provide resources for education and human capital development in these countries, because its money, again, would be lost in the mix. There are a large number of donors involved. There are huge budgets, national budgets, devoted to education. Frankly, much of that money is wasted. Much of that money ends up gets wasted through corruption, through misallocations, and Southeast Asia is known for its very poor pedagogic outcomes. So how can Korea use its resources for improving human capital? My suggestion would be that it use that money to the extent that it can get students into Southeast Asia, to provide more education within Southeast Asia, to bring in workers from Southeast Asia to provide skills. Korea has a lot to offer. Those who would visit Southeast Asia would learn a great deal about trade orientation, about export orientation, about having an economy that is well integrated with the rest of the world and the advantages that come from that. Korea has this remarkable story of being able to grow very rapidly without having increases in inequality. So there's a lot that Korea can offer, But that learning can take place by a younger generation, which, if invited into Korean education institutions, would then go back and take those lessons back with them. And so, in a sense, providing technical assistance for infrastructure on the one hand, bringing in young students into universities and workers to provide them with new skills so that they can go back to these countries would be enormously beneficial and would, to my mind, be a very effective use of Korean ODA resources. So with that, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. In the case of Korea's economic relations with India, one has to keep in mind 2-3 background facts. One was that until the 80s, India's growth rate was very anemic. And of course, Korea began its very rapid growth rate beginning from the 60s. The second was that because Korea was so much part of the US alliance and India's relations with the US was sort of lukewarm, there wasn't much of a relationship between India and South Korea. Now, this began to change from the 90s onwards as India began to liberalize and India began to grow much more, rapidly. So the Korean-India economic relationship is relatively recent, and I think it has much promise for several reasons. One is that, and this matters a lot in Asia, there is no bad history between the two countries. Second is, in some ways, they are very complementary. Korea, of course, has been excellent at manufacturing. India has been anything but excellent in manufacturing. But India has been much better at services. And as Vikram said, that's the future of growth, is going to be service-led growth. And that gives India a bit of a comparative advantage. So, just very, very, briefly, bilateral trade relations between India and Korea are about 45 years. As was stated earlier, the trade is about 21.5 billion, and the leaders of both countries have set a target of 50 billion by 2030. And now you see a sort of new part of this relationship that's emerging is around technology and startups. When it comes to FDI, Korea it's the 14th largest FDI investor in India. Its FDI is about 6 billion. But what we see is that its pace has really begun to increase in the last few years. The largest ones have been companies like Hyundai, Samsung. So it's basically the big Chaebol companies. There's some investment by Indian companies in Korea, but it's relatively modest. When it comes to trade, the trade relationship really began to pick up sharply after 2010 when the two countries signed the Korea-India Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. And India is Korea's 20th biggest source for imports, but it's the 7th largest sort of export market. So what you see in this trade relationship is that it's been growing, but not extremely rapidly. And the trade is very much in favor of Korea. So that's the trade balance between the two countries. So Korea enjoys a pretty healthy balance of payments surplus in its trade relationship with India. The exports to Korea from India are surprisingly, I not expected, is actually fuel. refineries, from India's refineries. And as you would expect, the imports from Korea to India are largely in sort of manufacturing, from electrical machinery to auto components and telecom equipment. Now, services trade, which seemed to offer and which was built into the economic partnership agreement, while it's been increasing, it's really still at fairly modest relationships. Only now are Korean financial institutions beginning to set up shop in India. But what is interesting is that there is a increase in the R&D relationship, and I'll just point out to you one of them, which is Samsung. Actually, Samsung's research in Bangalore is its largest R&D hub outside Seoul, and along with its R&D facilities in 2 other cities in India, they employ 9,000 engineers just in the R&D. So it's basically trying to leverage India's large group of human capital in sort of tertiary educated. And what you see, these R&D collaborations are in sort of 5G, AI, and the Internet of Things. Samsung is now also beginning to actually create a large fund to funding Indian startups, and it has a plan to invest in about 100 of them in the next 5 years. Now, I thought I'd take this opportunity to touch one part of the relationship, which has been very important for India, but not for Korea, to see if it offers any opportunities. So one way to think is, if you look at Korea's the demographics, and you can see that there's going to be a very sharp fall in the working age population. This is the latest data like from the UN, and this is the percentage of population aged 20 to 64 years. And as you can see, Korean growth, the spectacular growth, sort of coincided with the rapid increase in the working age population from 70 to 2020, but now it's really going to fall among the fastest of any countries in the world. In India's case, of course, it's not the opposite, but it's almost the opposite. You have a very large momentum that is still continuing, and the decline. And this, mind you, is on a population base of 1.3 billion. So there's a very large number in the size of the working age population, right? So you can see, if you put them side by side, that in terms of a complementarity in the case of working age population, in one case a sharp decline, in the other case still a large demographic momentum. Now, part of this, you find that India is the largest country of immigrants in the world, and as you can see, it's almost 75% more than that of China's, and this, of course, is both to countries in the Gulf and to many of the OECD countries. This is Indian immigrants in the US, and as you can see, when you look at education and income, Indian immigration, like to the US, is really a complete outlier. And this is now the second largest immigrant group in the US after Mexico. And what this graph is showing you is the education and incomes of different immigrants in the United States. And it's really the two tail ends are immigrants from Mexico and immigrants from India in terms of income and education. So this group has been pretty successful in terms of outcomes when it migrates to OECD countries. And it would be fairly similar if you did it in Australia, Canada, and the UK. Now, but when you look at immigration into South Korea, you find that there are virtually no immigrants from India. As expectedly, China is the largest. But if you go down, given the sheer size of Indian immigration around the world, South Korea sort of stands out in its sheer absence. Now, even from South Asia, what is interesting is that workers from India are the least or the smallest in South Korea compared to Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. And it's, of course, it's surprising for two reasons, both because, of course, the sheer population of India and the sheer extent of migration from India. It's not clear to me why that's the case. Now, in principle, SEPA had a provision of the temporary movement of professionals in 163 categories. So it's not that there is no agreement that allows for the movement of people. My sense is that the key gap is the low number of Indian students studying in Korea, which is the building block for a lot of Indian immigration around the world. So if you look at, for instance, international students in the US and around the world, basically the two largest are China and India, right? And so you have students, and so expectedly, students from China are also the largest in Korea. So international students in South Korea have been increasing rapidly. They virtually increased by order of magnitude in the past, 15 years. And, really dominated by Chinese students from China, which is almost half, followed by Vietnam. But the Indian numbers are so small that at least I couldn't even find them sort of in the data. So I'm just using a 1% as a question mark, not that I had the exact numbers. So again, it's something which is not clear to me why that's the case. Now, I think if one looks forward, one of the reasons that India's manufacturing had not done well was it was not part of the supply chains that had been specially built up by Japanese and Korean companies through ASEAN and of course with China. This has begun to change, and in the last 2 years, this government has been very aggressive. So Foxconn has invested now hugely with large factories. So it's the first big movement of manufacturing. And last year, the largest investment of a Korean company in India was Samsung, again in large manufacturing, facilities. So this combination of a more receptive climate for manufacturing in India, which this government is building, and last week it announced a very sharp cut in the corporate tax rate to 25% from 33%. So it was very aggressive in trying to lure firms to invest in India. And at the same time, building the potential of India's comparative advantage in services trade. India's IT exports are now about $120 billion. They are about 40% of its total goods exports. So that is the real advantage, comparative advantage that India has. And the question is whether the two countries can collaborate in their complementarities, one whose excellence is in manufacturing and the other whose comparative advantage seems to be in services trade. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Hong-il Kwa, working in KIAPT. I'm very delighted to introduce Korea's new southern policies in this very important event. First, although the doctor you already mentioned about the new southern policies key concept, but I'm gonna briefly talking about the new southern policy to you. And second, I'm going to explain why Korean government design and implement New Southern policy. And finally, I'm going to explore how the outer case New Southern policies work with the ASEAN's policies. Okay. Korea's New Southern policy has set the vision people-centered community of peace and prosperities, which are composed of three communities: people and prosperity and peace, which is matched with the ASEAN's community launched in 2015. In November 2017, President Moon announced the New Southern policy in Indonesia for the first time. In 2018, a Korean government launched the Presidential Committee on New Southern Policy, which reserved the directions for promotion of a New Southern policy. The following slide shows the directions for promotion of NSPs. First, the committee set the goal of people community as 50 million of mutual visitors by 2020 annually. We believe that exchanging people promote to share knowledge and know-how, as well as to have more opportunity to understand each other's. For your information, in 2018, 2.46 million of ASEAN people visited Korea, and about 9 million Koreans visit ASEAN again. And second, the goal of prosperity community is to build a cornerstone. Maybe you can see that this part. Yes, the cornerstone for mutual beneficial, future-oriented economic corporations. Korea and ASEAN agreed to make effort to reach the trade $200 billion by 2020. Given the rapidly increasing trend in trade between them, it is surely achievable. For your information, in 2017, the trade between them was $114 billion, and in 2018, it was $160 billion. Third, the goal of peace community is to construct a peaceful and safe environment in the regions. A Korean government mainly focus on the terrorism, cybersecurity, and a collaboration for building a peaceful Korean peninsula. In 2019, the Presidential Committee on New Southern Policy resolved the extensive expansion of the cooperation areas, in particular economic areas. The committee added the innovation industrial field related to the first industrial revolution, such as artificial intelligence, 5G, data economy, and biohealthcare, digital commerce, etc., into original key cooperation areas, such as infrastructure and the commodity trade, tourism, and finance. A New Southern policy has different features from the previous policy toward the ASEAN regions. New Southern policy expands its scope and diplomacy level and policy connectivities. For example, in the respect of policy scope, New Southern policy includes security and diplomacy and socio-cultural cooperation as well as economic cooperations, while previous one mainly focused on the economic issues. In the diplomatic aspect, before the New Southern policy, the majority of meetings are one-time formal meetings. But after the New Southern policies, a multi-layered and repetitive meeting is emphasized. This slide shows how New Southern policy has been progressed. For 2 years after New Southern policy was announced, the President Moon has visited India and all 10 ASEAN member states, as well as held summits. By doing so, Korean government capitalized on this year, marking 30 years of South Korea-ASEAN relations, including through the November ASEAN ROK commemorative summit and the first Mekong-Korea summit taking place in Busan. And let's think about why Korea designed the New Southern policies. This can be explained by the push factor and the pull factors of a New Southern policy. In the economic aspect, ASEAN and India grow very fast thanks to their FDI-friendly environment and favorable production conditions. On the contrary, already many professors already mentioned about this part. Korea needs a new growth engine because of the population structures. So I'm going to show you that in detail. First of all, we need to see why ASEAN regions and India are valuable to Korea. The full factors of NSP, New Southern Policy, can explain it. ASEAN region and India has recorded high growth rate, as you see, over the last 10 years. The GDP of ASEAN reached $2.7 trillion in 2017, and which is the sixth largest in the world. Moreover, the forecasting agency, the CIM actually, predicted that India's GDP will be third largest in the world in 2024. In addition, the great advantage of ASEAN region and India is the largest population, as you see. The share of the young workforce is much greater than Korea. These valuable factors can help to solve the difficulties that Korea faces. Another full factor is ASEAN region and India are rising trade partners of Korea. As this table shows, ASEAN is the second largest Korea's trading partner. As you see, while Japan's shares of Korea total trade is decreasing, ASEAN's share is increasing. This is attributed to the direct investment of Korean companies into the ASEAN region. I'll show you in the next slide. In addition, after New Southern Policy announced, the U.S. and China China's share of Korea's total trade are increased. This is an evidence that New Southern Policy does not pursue to downgrade relations with major powers, but upgrade relations with Indo-Pacific regional partners. That is, the aim of New Southern Policy is to establish more balanced diplomatic and economic relations. And Korea's foreign direct investment flow into ASEAN is greater than that into China now. ASEAN is the second largest investment destination following the US. The US is the #1 destination of Korea's investment. Korean multinational companies and SMEs have jointly constructed their production network across ASEAN regions. These activities are most private-oriented. I mean, the Korean government didn't provide support for the Korean companies working in ASEAN regions before the New Southern policies. But after New Southern policy introduced, the policy includes supporting policies for the private economic activities. For example, the supporting local ASEAN companies to working with the Korean companies by sharing skill, knowledge, and know-how of rapid growth. Ultimately, ASEAN firms will participate in the Korean firms' supply chains that we hope. And the push factors represent the reason that Korean government has to design and implement New Southern policies. As the graph shows, Korea's potential growth rate is decreasing as you see in this time goes. It can be explained by various reasons, though. The key reason is the rapid change of population structures. According to a Korean Statistics Bureau, about 50% of total population is over 65 years old in 50 years. As the population ages, the Korea's population ages, the productivity will weaken and level of investment and savings rate will fall as well. Korea's potential growth rate is also suffering from the rapid reduction of the number of workforces. Another reason is the increasing in global economic uncertainties. From 1990 to 2007, the globalization with fully grown supply chain pushed up the trade thanks to tariff cut, cheap communications, and lower cost transport. After the rise of domestic supply chain in China and other emerging economies, the global trade intensity is decreased because they are now consuming more of what they produce. So trade growth has been slow. Moreover, the US-China trade war may cause a long-lasting damage of world economy and could put the world into a totally uncertain era. Moreover, if it is a Thucydides trap, the tension cannot be easily resolved. Furthermore, the Japan's tightening exporting regulation on the export to Korea makes Korea face another economic uncertainties. But this dispute stems from the strong refuse of past wartime crimes from Japanese government. If you believe that a trade dispute between Japan and Korea will seriously undermine the manufacturing value chain in Northeast Asia, the potential, the political and historical issues should be separate from the economic issues. As you see, the Korea faces uncertainties that it had never experienced before. Together with them, Korea needs partners to have a heart-to-heart relationships. In the diplomatic aspect, one more push factor can be considered. We believe that without peace in Korean Peninsula, the regional prosperity is hardly accomplished. Traditionally, ASEAN has had a strong diplomatic relationship with North Korea. If ASEAN and ROK work together to persuade North Korea to give up the nuclear weapon, we may have another chance to grow together by developing North Korea, as in President Moon's peace economy. Another proof factor can be given in diplomatic aspect. Korean government has a vision. This is actually vision to construct Northeast Asia plus community for responsibility sharing. We believe that a Korean peninsula may work as a bridge between the southern region and northern regions. That is, Korea can contribute to make a link between developing country and developed countries as a middle power countries. By doing so, a community sharing responsibility can be constructed in Northeast Asia under the premise of the peace of Korean Peninsula. As we talked, rising uncertainty pushes Korea to prepare for new cooperation framework with the neighboring countries, which is the New Southern Policy. I believe that the U.S.'s vision for free and open economy, free and open Indo-Pacific, also reflect all these changes, although the hidden intention is to contain China, though. Okay. Now, it's time to think about how New Southern Policy can collaborate with the ASEAN. Last June, ASEAN adopted the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. There is no mention of any country or major powers, not just China and the US, but also Japan, India, and Russia. It avoids any strategic language or tone, and there are no military aspects to the document. Rather, it is more consistent with ASEAN's comprehensive security approach with an emphasis on implementing existing and exploring other ASEAN priority area of cooperations, including maritime cooperation, connectivity, the sustainable development goals, and other possible areas. Most areas are in line with those of the New Southern policies. Particularly, the infrastructure related to the connectivity are the key. Among three pillars of New Southern policies, prosperity is directly related to economic cooperation. Of course, other pillars are also related to the economic cooperation, though. When President Moon announced New Southern Policy in Indonesia, he pointed out 4 priority areas like this: transportation, energy, water resource, a smart city, but smart infrastructures. Moreover, Korea set up $100 million of global infrastructure fund, which will invest mainly in 4 priority areas for closer cooperation between Korea and ASEAN member states. I know it is a pity that the size of fund is relatively small. However, South Korea has a strong strength that other competitors do not have. South Korea has the successful experience of infrastructure development with very small resources. In addition, Korea is willing to cooperation with the ASEAN region with sincerity, because South Korea was one of the furthest countries in the world in the 1950s and 1960s. We all agree that human resource development is the key to grow from South Korea's experience. Korea is willing to share its experience and lessons with the ASEANs. Frankly, Korea has a shortage of financial capacity. However, we can gather with assistance of other like-minded allies, observing the existing rules of market economy, like what Korea did. Fortunately, the US announced the vision for free and open Indo-Pacific at the IFAC meeting in 2017. This is embodied in the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report 2019, published in June this year. I think the objective of free and open Indo-Pacific to encourage China and other countries to abide by existing rules and principles ultimately. If this is true, free and open Indo-Pacific needs to gather more like-minded allies by a good reputation, because China's financial scale is huge. To get a good reputation, the US emphasized on openness. That's why the Australia, India, Japan, and Indonesia promote their own version of Indo-Pacific radar. For example, the US wants a free and open Indo-Pacific with a more overt military strategic orientation. In comparison, Indonesia seeks an open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. However, the US, ASEAN, and others stress out the sovereignty of each country, good governance, security, and sustainable development as well. Moreover, for the US to get a good reputation, free and open Indo-Pacific considers infrastructure development as a key tool. As in the box, various efforts to develop infrastructure are included in the Pacific regions. As we see above, South Korea has development experience with little resource, while the US has high standard loan of capital, and ASEAN has large demand for infrastructure. Moreover, Korea's New Southern policy, ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, the US's free and open Indo-Pacific share the common values such as openness, transparency, and inclusiveness. Therefore, the US, ASEAN, and Korea can use their strengths in a complementary ways. This slide shows how we can link between New Southern policy and connectivity projects in Master Plan in ASEAN Connectivity 2025. MPEC 2025 proposed 5 strategic areas: sustainable infrastructure, digital innovation, seamless logistics, regulatory excellence, people mobility. Among them, I believe sustainable infrastructure and digital innovations are important. Sustainable infrastructure includes exchanging lessons on smart urbanization models across ASEAN member states that can simultaneously deliver economic growth and a good quality of life. Thus, we can guess ASEAN's demand for smart city constructions. Moreover, digital technology in ASEAN could potentially be worth up to $625 billion by 2030, which is 8% of ASEAN GDP in that year. Capturing this opportunity requires the establishment of a regulatory framework for delivering new digital service. In this regard, 5G is the core technology to realize smart city and digital services. If the US and its allies can create new 5G ecosystem by working together, a new economic order can be created to replace the existing order specialized in commodity trade. In addition, these activities can fulfill ASEAN's demand. Okay? Thank you.
Okay. We heard from the Professor Nehru about the economic cooperation between Korea and ASEAN countries, and he clearly explained why the trade with Korea has been concentrated only on Vietnam and Singapore. And he also highlighted trade restrictions on ASEAN countries, and a very important concept of global value chain and human capital issues. And Professor Kapoor focused on the India, and he started with the talking about the SIPA and R&D, recent R&D collaboration between India and Korea. And he underlined the population aging issue and migration. And actually, I just observed that there are very common observation that the ASEAN countries and India have a very different demographic structure from the Korean case. So 1 or 2 decades before, serious population aging in ASEAN countries and India could help the Korean lack of the labor participation in Korea in these days. Okay, and finally, Professor Kwak very nicely summarized the new Southern policy of South Korea, and he kind of opened up the possibility to reconcile with the free, open Indo-Pacific strategy with the new Southern policy. So I think we are well ready to discuss these issues. I guess we began this session a little bit late,
yeah.
so I think we can have 25 to 30 minutes to discuss the trade and migration issue in ASEAN countries and Korea. Okay, so it will be appreciated if you raise your hand and identify yourself and point out to whom your question or comments go, please. Okay.
Hi, my name's Sam Crosby. I have a question for Dr. Kwok. I was wondering if there's any part of the I was wondering if there's any part of the new Southern policy that's that is aimed to tie in immigration from the ASEAN countries, given the Statistics Bureau's projection of like the 50% population over 65. If those two issues are in any way connected, whose 100 policy agendas, 100 policy goals tie in immigration from those countries at all.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions, and then we can respond all together. Please. Okay, Ambassador Lee.
Thank you. It's a good presentation. I have one question to Dr. Nehru and one question to Dr. Kwok. First, Dr. Kwok, you said the first most priority principles of the new Southern policy is people-centered exchanges or cooperation with the Korea and ASEAN. So it's a very good idea. But my question is, how many ASEAN has 10 ASEAN member state, can enjoy visa-free status from South Korea? I understand 9 out of 10 the member state has given us visa-free, so I'm enjoying that. But from the ASEAN side, how many enjoyed visa-free to come into South Korea? That is my question. And another one is the Professor Nehru is more theoretical issues. South Korea and ASEAN, the cooperation has developed when we had this East Asia developed regional production networks between the three Northeast Asian countries and the ASEAN. We have strengthened our production networks. That's give us South Korea and Japan and China and ASEAN also enjoy them, and we can make a very high economic growth in last year from 1980s to 2000. But it's now we have the troubles between the Korea and Japan, and Korea and Japan and China, and the USA and China. So all the situation, the environment, I think getting worse. It's very damaging. The systems we have developed for last 30 years. That means the regional production network is now is undermined amid that conflict between the countries. So do you think still we can, that system, regional production network system will sustain in the years in the future? That is my question. Thank you.
Okay, one more question in the back.
Hi, so my name is Monet Stokes. I'm part of the Korea Studies program here. So my question is in regards to migrant issues within Korea, especially for migrants coming from Southeast Asia. So there's been a lot of publicity regarding workers' rights and their position within small and medium enterprises in particular. And so I was wondering if you can see this as a potential barrier to the new Southern policy into furthering cooperation between ASEAN and South Korea. And if it is, do you see that there's a way that these new agreements under the new Southern policy can actually assist in bettering the situation of migrants in South Korea?
Okay, Professor. Oh,
Because the previous questions have been directed to Professor Nehru and Dr. Kwak, I should give one question to Professor Kapoor, not to alienate him. And you made a very important and interesting observation about the fact that lack of Indian students going to Korea to study. Given that, for example, in the U.S., India students, the largest foreign student contingent. How is that? Now, we at the KDI school, I think, I don't have exact numbers, but I have the impression that we get more students from Bangladesh and Pakistan than India. That is somewhat strange, right? Recently, we also have, in our degree programs, but we also run short-term training programs, mostly for government officials. And recently, we've been getting a lot of requests from Indian civil servant training agencies, both central government and some regional governments, and they really like to come to us, and there is just growing demand. We cannot really meet all those demands. Even though you just said it was a puzzle to you, I'm sure you have some thoughts about why Korea is not on the preferred list of destination countries for students. And in this connection, I just wanted to ask for your comments about my perception, which may be wrong, which is that Korea wave, K-wave, K-pop and K-drama, and these things is quite huge across the world, here in the U.S. and Europe, Africa, Iran. K-drama is the huge, and Southeast Asia also. K-wave is very, very popular, but I think I heard very little about K-pop or K-drama being popular in India. And so maybe there's some cultural distance between the two countries, despite the fact that a lot of Koreans have very favorable views about India. So I'd like to ask you a comment on my observations.
Okay, let's respond to 4 questions and comments. So in the order of Professor Nehru, Kapoor, and Kwak, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Ambassador, for a very large question. The future of global trade and its implications for the production networks that are developed in Asia. Well, right. True. So let me answer that in 3 parts. The first part is that there's just been a recent study that's come out, a very comprehensive study, which looks at 4 dimensions of cross-border economic flows: trade, capital, people, migration, and technology, cross-border tech, and a very extensive study. I must say I would recommend it to all of you. And what it shows is that despite popular perception and despite these various forces of protectionism that seem to be accelerating in trade, actually the aggregate measure of cross-border economic integration has continued to proceed at much the same pace as it did in the past. So that's just an interesting point to put on the table. And what it tells me, and if you'll pardon the expression, is that commerce trumps politics. That's why I said, if you'll pardon the expression. So, in other words, I've always believed that the forces of private sector investment, trade, etc., and the desire to raise standards of living, lower cost of production, improve productivity, have an inexorable logic to them of increasing efficiency. And one of the ways that efficiency is increased is by fragmenting production in different parts of the world, and Asia has been superb at this, in bringing down the overall cost of production. And I don't think that logic is going to go away. Yes, there is a weakening of bilateral trade arrangements, say, between the United States and other countries. There's a weakening, even which is much more dangerous in my view, a weakening of the WTO, which could actually lead to an undermining of the current global trading arrangements. So I see them definitely as dangers, but I believe, and this is something one's difficult to look into the future, but I believe that eventually people will recognize that trade and these cross-border flows deliver prosperity, but they do not deliver egalitarianism. They do not deliver equality. That to deliver equality or more equality in societies requires many more different kinds of policies, including fiscal policy, education policy, and the entire range of other policies. But it really should not be up to trade and financial flows to deliver those sorts of results. Because I think there's a grave mistake, and I think it's a mistake that populists have made now throughout the world, but including in this country, that it is trade and globalization that is to blame for the dramatic increases in inequality. And now there's a recognition that may be many other factors. Clearly, technology is one of them. The second is the rising concentration of industry. That's yet another. And so blaming everything on just one set of arrangements, frankly, would be a mistake. And I hope that sanity will eventually prevail and allow this driver of growth to continue. But who knows?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I have the answer. So one is language. But if language were the major barriers, there are actually, last year there were more Indian students studying in China than the United Kingdom, which of course historically was the destination for Indian students. So the language issues are as acute in some ways in China, and they're also going to Japan, so that should not be the reason. Now, the base, Indian higher education has expanded so rapidly that the base is very large now. So after China, India has the largest number of students in higher education. It's about close to 40 million students enrolled in colleges and universities. So one just needs to siphon a tiny fraction of that to come for graduate studies, and you still have a very large unmet demand. I think the soft power thing is an interesting, because the reverse is also true. Because if there's one thing India has been reasonably good at, is the power of Bollywood as a global force, similar to K-pop. We were actually discussing it amongst ourselves yesterday, because Bollywood films do very well in China. And why don't they have any grip in Korea, right? You would expect actually the opposite, because, as you know, relations between India and China are less, they are lukewarm at best. And so you would expect fewer students to go to China. You would expect a lesser demand. Actually, after Hollywood, the largest films, among the top 5 grossing films in China in the last few years, there's always been a film from Bollywood. So it is Bollywood's largest market outside India has been there. Now, I don't have a good answer for you. When I began to prepare for this, it struck me, and I could not, I realized I just didn't have the answer. Because the obvious answers don't fit. Because there is much larger movement. And also because India has established a strong, with Thailand and Japan, sort of Buddhist circuit in India, and where people come from this, but fewer South Koreans, far more Thais, Burmese, sort of Buddhist, and from Japan, and now increasingly from China as well. But again, not from Korea. So there's clearly something that is absent. Now, whether it is just both countries have not done enough to sort of promote each other in ways that would bring a certain greater consciousness, that might be the reason, but I'm not sure.
But recognizing the problem is the start.
Right, yeah.
Ambassador's question is, I think, quite related to the immigrant policies, the question from the floor, right? So I think the visa issue is a very important one. I agree that. So also the Presidential Committee on New Southern Policy also had the same concerns. So this year, last June, I think, they decide that one of the key core projects is the visa-free status for the ASEAN member states. So they will be soon, the problem is resolved. Another question comes from the migrant issues, right? The Korean government also recognized the problems. That's why last year, I think, the Korean government established ASEAN Cultural Center in Busan. That's the opportunity to understand their lives and their cultures of ASEAN peoples. So if Koreans understand their lives, maybe we can understand their lifestyle, and then they also going to be understand a Korean's lifestyle. We want to provide more opportunity to share the cultures. So it's gonna be my answer is actually the same as the Dr. Kapur's. The recognition is the very starting point. So New Southern policy is actually 2 years ago, the not old one. So, but our government changed our status for the immigrant and then or ASEANs. So there will be all the problems resolved soon.
Is the visa-free issue?
Visa-free issue and others problems, cultural issues.
Okay, so I'll proceed to next set of questions from the floor.
Thank you. My name's Mitchell Blatt. I'm in the Korea Club and the Korea Studies, and I have a question for Professor Kwok. Talking about the new, the Southern policy and some of the other policies relating to Asia, I heard you mention something about containing China, although I wasn't sure whether I heard right. But so could you elaborate on whether there's a containment policy?
Thank you. My name is Michael Choi Kim. Basically, I'm curious about, thanks to Professor Nuru on the demographics, and yes, it's no secret. South Korea's population is rapidly aging and with a very, very low birth rate. But many of the ASEAN nations and also India have working age populations that are coming up. One of the things, and this question is not just for Dr. Nuru, but for the whole panel, but I'm wondering, very simplistic reasoning here, could Korea increase its population by having people from ASEAN and possibly India, although I think language is a bit of a barrier, becoming citizens and taxpayers of Korea?
Okay, I guess that this might be final question from the floor.
Thank you. My name is Don Kirk. I'm a journalist. I spent time in Korea. One gets the impression that the Korean economy is not really doing all that well now, and as well as previously, and that the government is taking measures to control or to decrease or diminish the power of the mighty chaebol. I wonder what effect this might have on investment and trade with Southeast Asia and India. Thank you.
Okay, so let's respond to the set of the questions. So, Professor Nehru, do you have something to add, or okay?
You want to start?
Kapoor?
Okay, let me start about the point about, does it make sense to have more migrants from, say, ASEAN going to Korea and becoming citizens there? Well, that certainly is an issue for Koreans to decide. But one of the dangers of an aging society, of course, is that you have a higher burden on the working level population because the dependency ratio rises, and correspondingly you have therefore a lower level of savings, and that leads to lower growth. So that's the sort of trajectory by which a declining labor force eventually leads to lower growth. The other dimension of a declining labor force also is that certain essential services are not provided, which are labor-intensive services. There are labor-intensive services, simply things like nursing, for example, looking after the aged population, providing basic public services in cities for which you do need people. You can't do those necessarily just with machines. And so there is a case for importing those kinds of workers. Now, whether those workers are permanent or not is a decision for the country. But there are very good examples of rotating migrants, that is, migrants who come in for a few years and then go back, and you have a fresh set of migrants coming in. And that way, you get over the rather complicated domestic political problem of having a large permanent migrant community as opposed to a rotating migrant community, which seems to be sometimes more acceptable from a political point of view.
I think just to reiterate, we're doing a lot of work on temporary migration programs around the world. I mean, in addition to trade and other factors, what we see is that a big part of the political backlash in many countries has come because of a perceived increase in permanent migrants. So societies are much more amenable to, and they are aware of the need to augment the labor supply, but they are uncomfortable with people who are culturally very and racially very, very different. That is just the reality, and it doesn't matter which country. Every country or most countries have that. So I think politically and economically, what is much more likely to fly is carefully designed temporary migration programs. And these work. I mean, Singapore has had that. Most Middle East countries have that. And much of agriculture, the one program of migration, the only program of migration that has increased under President Trump has been for temporary agricultural workers, because his constituencies are in sort of rural areas, and young Americans are not willing to work on farms. So you need workers. So Canada has that, Australia has that. So there are temporary worker migrations that work in a range of countries. And I suspect that that is the more likely path Korea is likely to go than one that brings in and then offers pathways to permanent residency.
Actually, I'm not expert on the migration issues, so I don't want to talk about that. But one follower asked me that about the containing China policy, blah blah something. But what I want to say is that that's not actually key. I want to say the New Southern policy does not include those kind of concepts. Actually, the New Southern policy focuses on the inclusiveness, like the ASEAN outlook on in the Pacific. So in the concept of the inclusiveness, so we can work with in the Pacific strategy and ASEAN's in the Pacific and other India's in the Pacific and Japan's in the Pacific, like that. So that's my key actually. So don't misunderstand, please. Okay, thank you.
The question about chaebols,
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm necessarily qualified to answer, but my understanding is as follows, that you can have a very high concentration of economic power, as the chaebols do in Korea, but still be subjected to competition by competing internationally. And what we see with Samsung and LG and so forth is that they are very powerful international competitors, and in fact, many of them have now invested abroad and developed these production chains that we were talking about, and they are subject to international competition. So internationally, these companies are sort of world competitors. They are at the forefront of technology, and consequently, I don't see how curtailing their power at home necessarily will affect their competitiveness abroad. Arguably, it may even harm them. So my sense is that one should look at not concentration, but at contestability. How contestable are these firms? And these firms are operating in very contestable high technology markets. They're competing against the best American, Japanese, European, and some Chinese firms. And in that sense, I see that they will, provided that they continue to be subjected to the forces of competition, they will continue to do well. Yeah.
Okay. So many Korean companies, actually the multinational companies, are working in the ASEAN area. Also, they can get a lot of efficiency gain, actually, by investing their monies to the Vietnam and also ASEAN regions. But another problem is that they are working only with the ASEAN, working only with the Korean companies, even if they invest their money into the Vietnam, they only work with Korean companies. There's no gap, no room to share the ASEAN local companies. So that's the another problem though. But by the working by Korean companies, they can get a more competitive, and then they can compete other partners. So that's the problem. But that's another competitiveness.
Okay, final remark from Dean Yu, and then I'm going to bring things close.
Correct. Misperception about Korean government policies towards Chaebol. Korean government does not aim to curb or diminish the powers of Chaebol. Its policy is to control abuse of that power, okay? In its dealings with SMEs, its subcontractors, in its various ways of tax evasion, and so that's the problem, okay? And imposing that discipline is not going to harm their abilities to invest and compete. So don't worry about that.
By implementing these certain policies, actually the ASEAN member states, the companies can join the Korean production network in the futures. So Korean company established job training centers in ASEAN area a lot, and they transfer technologies, and they produced a lot of workers. And then Korean companies going to be hired them, and they're going to get the technology, and maybe the workers can establish their own companies. Maybe they're gonna go into relationship with other Korean companies. That's the future of our big picture of the new southern policies.
Okay, we could continue, but I think it's a good idea to close this session so that we can proceed smoothly with the security and diplomatic issues of today's program. So I like to appreciate each of you for participating and bringing your expertise to this gathering. So why don't we give big hands to our speakers?